Hello and welcome to Lecture 2. We'll be covering the basic theory of international economics using demand and supply. Some of this will be review from prior economics courses, and so hopefully we can build upon what you already know and add to it some information in regards to international economics and how it affects how countries trade with one another. So let's get started. So this chapter 2, and then the chapters following it, chapters 3 through 7, look at how trade works by comparing two worlds. And these are hypothetical worlds. In one world, no trade is allowed. So there's no trade outside of the country. And in the other world, the government just stands aside and lets individual businesses and households trade freely across national borders without any frictions there. Okay, so we're going to answer 4 questions about trade, looking at it from these two different worlds. The first question is, why do countries trade? What is the basis for trade, especially the product or commodity composition? Number 2, for each country, what are the overall gains or losses from trade? 3, what are the effects of trade on each country's economic structure, production and consumption? And 4, what are the effects of trade on the distribution of income within each country? Who are the winners and who are the losers? So let's start first by looking at just some basics of economics. You'll remember supply and demand. Well, let's first talk about demand. Demand for a product depends on a number of factors, such as tastes, the price of this product, the price of other products, as well as income. So there are charts, graphs that we will look at where it'll show the quantity that consumers will buy at each possible market price, other things being equal. We call this the demand curve, and we'll look at some demand curves and some supply curves here in just a little bit. But again, the curve will show the quantity that consumers will be willing to buy at each possible market price. It shows the value that consumers place on units of the product because it indicates the highest price that some consumer is willing to pay for each unit. And a change in one of the other drivers of quantity demanded for a product, such as taste, the prices of other products, or income, causes a shift in the demand curve. So we can either move along the demand curve depending on market price, or if there is a change in one of the other drivers of quantity, it can shift the entire demand curve, and we'll get into some of that as we go through this course. Now let's talk a little bit about demand responsiveness. How responsive is quantity demanded to a change in price? And there's a key concept here of elasticity. A measure of responsiveness that is unit-free is elasticity, which measures the percent change in one variable resulting from a 1% change in another variable. So the price elasticity of demand is the percent change in quantity demanded resulting from a 1% increase in price. And some products are very elastic, and some other products are very inelastic. And we'll talk about what that means as we get a little deeper into some of the concepts that we'll talk about. Again, this should all be reviewed to you. And as always, I recommend reading the chapters in the book. You will not get enough from the lecture slides to do well on the exams alone. And so you should think of it book first, lecture slides second, quizzes third for your sources of information to do well on the exam. Next is another concept called consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the increase in the economic well-being of consumers who are able to buy the product at a market price lower than the highest price that they're willing to and able to pay for the product. In other words, the price of the product is below what some consumers are willing to pay for it. So the difference between what the current price is and what a consumer is willing to pay for it is what we call the consumer surplus. They didn't have to pay as much as they would have been willing to pay. Moving on to supply, so we've talked about demand. We're going to talk about the same concepts, but looking at it from the supply side. So what determines how much of a product is supplied by a business firm or other producer into the market? So a firm supplies the product because it's trying to earn a profit on its production and sales activities. One influence on how much a firm supplies is the price that the firm receives for its sales. The other major influence is the cost of producing and selling the product. So one is the price that they can sell it for, the other is the cost of actually making that product and selling it. So as with the demand curve, we have a supply curve, and this shows the quantity that producers will offer for sale at each possible market price, other things being equal. It shows the marginal cost of producing units of the product. A change in one of the other drivers of quantity supplied for a product, prices and availability of inputs, technology, or number of competing firms, causes a shift in the supply curve. So we can either move along the supply curve, but if there is a change to one of the drivers of quantity supplied for the product, then that entire curve can move. And so we'll look at that a little bit more deeply as we go forward. So the producer surplus, similar to the consumer surplus, the producer surplus is the increase in the economic well-being of producers who are able to sell the product at a market price higher than the lowest price that would have drawn out their supply. In other words, they're willing to sell it at a lower price, but they can sell it at a higher price. So the difference between the price they were willing to sell it at and the price they actually sold it at, assuming it's higher, is what we call a producer surplus. And as with demand, there's supply responsiveness. The price elasticity of supply measures the percent increase in quantity supplied resulting from a 1% increase in the market price. Now let's take a look at the demand and supply curves. We're going to look at demand and supply curve for motorbikes. And you can see on the left-hand side is the demand curve. On the right-hand side is the supply curve. Up above, we've got the formulas for these curves. And you can see that these are linear formulas. So this is the quantity demanded equals A minus B times P. So A is our x-intercept. That's what the amount demanded would be if the price was 0. And that has to do with the other inputs not related to price. B is the slope of this line. And that determines how elastic or inelastic it is. And P is the price. So you can see if we plug this in here, so the quantity demanded equals 90,000 minus 25P. If the price is 0, that makes this part 0. So consumers would demand 90,000. So you can see that there. On the right-hand side, we have something similar with the supply curve. You can see the supply curve, there's a positive relationship. The higher the price, the more producers are willing to supply. On the demand side, the higher the price, this is a negative relationship. The higher the price, the less consumers are willing to buy. The lower the price, the more consumers are going to demand. And so we're going to put these two together on the next slide. So you can see this. So this is our classic supply and demand, and where they meet is equilibrium. So all things being equal, in our domestic environment, this is what we see. The amount demanded, where it hits the supply curve, that is the amount that will be produced and purchased. And so we saw at a price of 2,000 with a quantity demanded of 40,000, this is where we'll end up. We'll see here in just a little bit how when we introduce international trade, it'll affect both quantity supplied and the unit price. And so hopefully that will be helpful as we move forward. Okay, so 2 national markets and the opening of trade. So up to this point, this shows us our supply and demand curves in an environment where there's no international trade. We have one country. This is happening all within its borders. This is the domestic trade. But when we move forward and add another country into this mix, now we have 2 national markets and the opening of trade. So I'm going to introduce a term that maybe you've heard before. It's called arbitrage. Arbitrage is buying something in one market and reselling the same thing in another market to profit from a price difference. So if, for instance, in the second country that we've added into this mix, if you can purchase a motorbike for less money in that country, you could buy it in that country and then bring it to your domestic market and sell it for a greater profit because you were able to purchase it at a lower price. So with no trade, differences in the price of a product between national markets creates an arbitrage opportunity that can lead to international trade. When traders see an opportunity where there's a mispricing or a difference in price, they see this arbitrage opportunity and they will then seek for ways to do international trade. So now let's talk about free trade equilibrium. As international trade in a product, and in our example, we're looking at motorbikes, develops between these 2 countries, it affects the equilibrium price in importing and exporting countries. So if there are no transport costs or other frictions, which obviously is not the real world, but to understand this theory, we'll assume no transport costs or other frictions. Free trade results in the new countries having the same price for motorbikes. So eventually both countries will have an equilibrium price that they'll reach, and they'll end up having the same price for motorbikes. We call this the free trade equilibrium price, the international price or the world price. So demand for imports is the excess demand or quantity demanded minus quantity supplied of a good within the US national market. So this assumes that, that less is supplied at the new world price within the US, our national market. Less is supplied than is demanded. So that leads to a demand for imports. The supply of exports is the excess supply. So assuming in the rest of the world or the other country, the motorbikes were being produced at originally below the world price, but because of international trade, and this free trade brings the price up for them, so more suppliers will want to supply. So the supply of exports is the excess supply, the quantity supplied minus the quantity demanded within that other country. And so we can see that these 2 will work with each other and benefit both countries. So here we can look at the effects of trade on production, consumption, and price with our demand and supply curves. A here is the US motorbike market. You can see our original supply and demand curves, and 2000 was our domestic equilibrium price. Here is our international motorbike market, which will lead us to a new world price, which gives us a new equilibrium. So here is the quantity demanded for imports, and here is the rest of the world's supply of exports. And where they meet is the new equilibrium. So it's a price of 1,000. So what happens, we start from our US pre-trade price. This is before imports happen at 2,000. But once imports are allowed and free trade begins, you can see the price drop from 2,000 to 1,000, which is the new world price. So what we have here is we have a mismatch looking domestically. So at the price of 1,000, domestic consumers want more. They want 65,000, not the 40,000 at the equivalent price of 2,000. So what we see here is at this price, we will have this amount of imports. We've got 50,000 imported at the price of 1,000, the new world price. Looking at the rest of the world's motorbike market, you can see the original equilibrium here of supply and demand gives us a rest of the world price of 700. But because of international trade and the exports to the US market, we can see the price goes up to 1,000, and this quantity of 50,000 is exported to the rest of the world. So this table down below shows a summary of what happens. So the effects of this trade, when we open borders and allow free trade, in this example, US, the price went from 2,000 down to 1,000. The quantity supplied domestically went down, down to 15,000 were supplied at the price of 1,000. But the quantity demanded jumped up. It jumped up to 65,000. And so this amount from 15 that's supplied domestically to 65 are imports. If we look at it from the perspective of the rest of the world, the price went up. It went from 700 up to 1,000. The quantity supplied domestically went up, and the excess is exported to the US. And we see what happened in the rest of the world is the quantity demanded actually went down. It went down from 50 down to 25 because of that increase in price. And so we can see how this affects both countries, but there are some benefits to both countries. In the US, consumers are able to buy it at a cheaper price. In the world, more can be produced and exported to the US for a profit. Let's look at this further, the effects of trade on well-being of producers, consumers, and the nation as a whole. So you can see we've got the same graphs here, but we've got these sections A, B, C, D, and E. In this graph, we've got B and D and N, and here we've got J, K, and N. It is clear through this the slide that the US consumers are winners here. So previously, you'll remember that the consumer surplus was anything above this line, which went through the old equilibrium. So C was the old consumer surplus. With imports and the decrease in price as a result, the consumer surplus is not only C, but we add these areas as well, A, B, and D. And so the benefit to the US consumer is quantifiable here. And in this example, it is $52.5 million. However, the US producers of the product are hurt by this shift from no trade to free trade. And so they receive a lower price for their product, and they're going to shrink production. So instead of 40,000, they're only going to produce domestically 15,000. So instead of A plus E for our producer surplus, now we just have E. So we have a loss to the producers of A. And that represents 27.5 million. When we take into account the net effect there, the 52.5 million gain in consumer surplus versus the loss in producer surplus or supply surplus, you can see that overall the country is better, but there are some winners and some losers. So how does it affect the exporting country? And this is a flip side. For the rest of the world, the analysis follows a similar path. Here, the shift from no trade to free trade increases the market price. So we can see it going from 700 to 1,000. The increase in price benefits motorbike producers in the rest of the world, whose producer surplus increases by area J, K, and N. So J, K, and N is now the new producer surplus. You can see that because this is the new amount supplied. So this is our producer surplus. The increase in price, however, hurts motorbike consumers in those countries, whose consumer surplus decreases by area J and K. So this consumer surplus that was coming from the $700 mark and this equilibrium, this area is now reduced by the J and K, which now goes to the suppliers. So the question is, which country gains more? This analysis shows us that each country gains from international trade, and it's clear that the whole world gains from this trade. The trade is a positive sum activity. The suppliers in the rest of the world benefit more than the consumers in those countries lose, and the consumers in the US benefit more than the producers lose. So the net gain is positive on both sides. Looking at just those areas on those graphs that we looked at, we can compare and see what is the total welfare effect of free trade. So let's first start by looking at United States. So here is our surplus with free trade. Consumers, as you can see, are the winners here. We've got A plus B plus C plus D. Producers had just E. The surplus to consumers without trade was just C. So the net effect for consumers, the positive effect is A plus B plus D. However, the surplus for producers prior to the free trade was A plus E. So they lost A. So the net effect for the US is B plus D. For the rest of the world, the consumers, you remember the prices went up on them, so they lost J plus K. That's a loss. But producers picked up J and K and added N because of their export to the United States. So the rest of the world benefits by N, and the US benefits by B plus D, so both benefit. So the effects on the importing country, the shift from no trade, which is an autarky, to free trade lowers the market price. The decrease in price will benefit consumers. This is what we call a welfare gain by a net amount of A plus B plus D. The decrease in price will reduce producer surplus by area A, as mentioned in the previous slide. The net gain from the free trade for the United States as a whole is A plus B plus D for the consumer minus A for the supplier, so we get a B plus D. The effects in the exporting country, the shift from no trade, autarky, to free trade raises the market price. For that, you'll remember it was from 700 to 1,000. The increase in price benefits producers in the rest of the world who produce the surplus. Their producer surplus increases by area J, K, and N. And the increase in price hurts the consumers of those other countries whose consumer surplus decreases by areas J plus K. So using the $1, one vote metric, we can say that the exporting country gains from the trade and that its net gain from the trade is area N. So which country gains more? This analysis shows that each country gains from international trade, so it is clear that the whole world gains from trade. Trade is a positive sum activity, and it is generally a good thing. The gains from opening trade are divided in direct proportion to the price changes that trade brings to the two sides. So if a nation's price changes X% as a percentage of the free trade price, and the price in the rest of the world changes Y%, then the nation's gain over the rest of the world's gain is X over Y. The side with the less elastic or steeper trade curve, the import demand curve or export supply curve, gains more. And so the slope of these curves is very important in understanding this. With that, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me during my office hours. You can call or email me. If my office hours don't work for you, please feel free to reach out to me and schedule a time. Thank you very much.